Hi, everyone. As promised, this is going to be the lecture for Chapter 3 on the self. Since we couldn't have class on Monday, for those of you who were in class on Wednesday, you can pick back up since we didn't quite finish the lecture, and you can pick up on the slides where we left off at Terra Management Theory. These slides are available on Sakai along with this lecture. So with that said, let me share my screen and get this going. All right. So this is chapter 3 on the self. Some of these things I'm going to breeze through pretty quickly since you're not here to answer questions. But again, the slides are available. So if I move a little bit fast, of course, you can drop back and kind of scope things out yourself. We'll start with a little activity. So if you're playing along at home, I want you to use the following scale to answer these questions. So compared to other people, how would you rate yourself? From a 1 to 7 scale at much below average to much above average. So where would you rate yourself on intelligence compared to other people? And where would you rate yourself on honesty compared to other people? And where would you rate yourself on friendliness compared to other people? So take a minute, just scratch something down on these answers, and we'll come back to this. We'll return to this later on in the lecture. Now, I have a little video here. I gave this a preface in class. I'm not going to show it. You can watch it on your own. But this is a skit from Saturday Night Live that was a joke about former President Trump, about how he saw himself. And I actually think this is a really good application of different ideas about self-perception. So take a minute, watch this, pause me, click this link, watch that, and then come back to the lecture. Okay, I'm going to assume you did that, and now you're back. Now let's outline what we're going to cover. So first, we'll start with some definitions, what we're actually addressing when we talk about research on the self. We'll talk about goals of self-perception. We'll talk a bit about self-esteem, which obviously is one of the more important concepts to come out of this research and something that most everybody agrees is very important, but we'll talk about why self-esteem is important and theories of why self-esteem is important. And then we'll focus on some biases in our self-perceptions. So first, let's start with what is the self? What are we addressing when we talk about the self? And this is something that I would say comes up probably more in philosophy than it does in psychology. And there are philosophical notions, especially in kind of Eastern religions and ideas about the self as kind of being an illusion, it's construction. And I would argue that that's true, but that doesn't mean it's not important. And that doesn't even mean it's not real, right? The self is a construct, much like other constructs that we view as being important. And they're important because they influence our lives. They influence our psychological lives, our perceptions of ourselves, our perceptions of others, our behaviors. So the self is a construct, but that doesn't make it any less real, just like intelligence is a construct. So let's do some definitions. When we're talking about the self, we're talking about some different things. One is the self-concept. These are our views and beliefs that we have about ourselves. Sometimes this is referred to as self-knowledge. I prefer the term self-concept to self-knowledge because knowledge implies that there's some factual basis, and our beliefs about ourselves, our views about ourselves, they may not reflect reality that well, right? So I think self-concept is a little bit better definition or a better term than self-knowledge is. Another thing we often talk about with the self, of course, is self-esteem. And this is just someone's evaluation toward themselves. This is their attitude. It could be positive, it could be negative, it could be a balance between them, right? So self-esteem is an individual difference trait. It's best to think of it on a spectrum where some people fall really hard on one side where they have super good inflated self-esteem. Some people fall on the other side where they have negative self-esteem, but in fact, most of us are in the middle. And it's more or less stable. So we're somewhere in the middle and we kind of fluctuate within those parameters of where we fall. But self-esteem does move, right, in response to our accomplishments or things that might happen to us. Finally, another big term to think about is self-presentation. So this is the process of trying to control how people see you. This is something we engage in literally every single day. Every time you do your hair or do your makeup or put on clothes or anything, right? So self-presentation are the cues you give off to other people. And in some ways, these are strategic. And I would argue some people probably put more effort into this than others. And we could measure who would be more likely to care about this or when people would be more likely to care about this, how it ties to motives, for instance. Okay, so let's talk about self-concept. And I do use the term self-knowledge here. I guess I shouldn't because I just told you why I don't like that term. But where do we get knowledge about ourselves? Where do we form our self-concept from? And there are various sources of knowing who we are. One is kind of the classic process of introspection, right? If I want to know who I am, I look inside my head, I evaluate what's deep down in my heart and soul. This is the process of looking inward to examine your thoughts and your feelings and your motives. And this is probably where many of us think that we get much of our self-information. This really follows along with the very modern scientific perspective of Homo economicus, right? The rational mind, the rational man is what they would have literally called that. The idea that we are very reasoned in our judgments and our beliefs, and we evaluate the pros and the cons, and we come to a reasoned conclusion. And I think this is true sometimes, but probably not nearly as much as we tend to hope or think that it is true. So there are some inherent problems with introspection. And one is that, often our feelings, our beliefs, our thoughts about things, they just are, right? We don't attribute a source to them until we're called to attribute a source to them, until someone asks, well, why do you think that? And then we just might make something up on the spot. So introspection is biased. Introspection is sometimes us just providing justifications, for instance. So other ways we can get information are really from our environment. Reflected appraisal is our perception of how others perceive and evaluate us, right? So again, these can be subject to bias, but sometimes it probably happen a little bit outside of it, and can even change your self-perception. So you might come to believe that you are helpful because other people tell you that you're a good friend and you've been there for them and they thank you for your time, and you realize, oh man, maybe I really do go out of my way and I help people. I'm a helpful person. Or maybe suddenly you're getting a lot of attention from potential suitors or significant others, and you think maybe I'm doing well, maybe I'm more attractive than I thought I was, right? So reflected appraisal is really seeing how other people see you, or at least perceiving how other people see you. That's a little bit different from direct feedback. Direct feedback is like summative or formative assessments. Direct feedback can come from teachers, for instance, right? So your direct feedback is like being graded on something, or can come from supervisors or from coaches. This is when people directly tell you about your traits and abilities, when you're evaluated on them. When someone just straight up says, hey, you're really smart, or if you're brave enough to have posted your picture on Hot or Not, or something like that. I don't even know if that's a website anymore. But you get rated on it, right? I wouldn't want that information. That'd be way too direct feedback. It's more objective feedback than reflected appraisal. And another way that we get self-concept or knowledge for our self-concept is our self-perception. Sometimes we just observe our own behavior. So for instance, if you asked me if I like the circus, I would say no, because I've never been to the circus. Obviously, I don't like it, or else I would have gone. But maybe if I went, I'd really enjoy it. So maybe I really don't know. I gave an example in class. It is a very real example that I thought I didn't like camping. And then I went camping with my friends and my partner, and I was like, well, this is a lot of fun. Maybe I actually do like camping. So sometimes we don't have an opinion at the ready. So we actually look back and say, well, what have I done? How do I act in these situations? That must be myself. Finally, and this is key, this really can't be downplayed, is that part of the reason that our self is so important is for social comparison, right? We compare our attitudes, our abilities, our behaviors, our performance. We compare it to others. We want to know how we fit in relation to other people, because a lot of this information just doesn't have any meaning unless it's provided in the context of others. So again, an example I could give is, say that you studied incredibly hard for an exam and you got 85%, you got a B, mid-level B, and you're upset because you really wanted an A, you felt like you deserved an A. But then you find out that the rest of the class got a 65 on average. So the average of the class got a C, and you did a whole, I'm sorry, that's a D. And you did a whole 20% better. Now you suddenly feel good because you're at the top in social comparison, right? So information by itself often is kind of useless. We have to have that information in the context to determine how we're doing in comparison to our peers or contemporaries. Okay, so hopefully you watched the video that illustrated the differences in self-perception versus how others perceive us, right? So how we actually are versus how we perceive ourselves. So the example was of course Donald Trump, and the joke was that he perceives himself as much more attractive and fit as John Cena, actually. In case you didn't get the part with the hands, it's because in some write-up of Trump, some journalist wrote that he has tiny hands. And I think this was in like the late 80s or early 90s. And for like decades afterwards, Trump would reiterate that he had big hands, he had huge hands. And so his self-perception is such that he just absolutely couldn't take feedback that goes against it, right? And we'll come back around to these ideas throughout the lecture. So what are the goals of the self? Remember that in social psychology, we believe that all things are tied to motives, right? Behavior is goal-oriented. So what are the goals of our self-perception? Well, one, we really do strive for self-knowledge. And it's because self-knowledge is very important, right? It provides a number of benefits in our environment. Namely, it provides us some kind of prediction and control of our environment. Now, we can't control others, but if we have an accurate assessment or a reasonably accurate assessment of our own abilities, we can better navigate our social relations. We can set realistic goals that we can accomplish. We can anticipate how others will respond to us and our environment, and we can better navigate the outcomes that we want. So there are specific goals that we want when it comes to self. And one, within reason, we want accuracy. We want to know where we stand in relation to other people, because we need to know where we stand, again, to be able to determine what we can reasonably accomplish or what we can get from our social world. But we also want verification, right? We are motivated to see ourselves in a certain light, and we seek information that verifies our self-view. I'm an academic. It's important to me that I'm smart, right? It always has been. And so I'm going to be more likely to seek information that verifies that, because it helps kind of keep that self-view going. Just an example. We do seek expansion and improvement. We often do want to see ourselves in a better light. And that kind of ties into what we call self-enhancement, which is when we seek information that either maintains our positive self-view or even boosts our positive self-view. So when we can self-enhance, when we can see ourselves in a better light, it brings along physiological rewards, right? So we get a kick of dopamine, and we get the serotonin of social relationships, and those things make us feel better. They make us feel happy. So we're going to be more likely to seek them again in the future. Okay, so if we get that little boost, it's going to affect our self-esteem, which brings us to this big concept, this big broad concept of self-esteem. So we should ask ourselves whether self-esteem is important. And of course, if we think it is, why? Why is self-esteem important? I'll let you think about that for just a minute. Hopefully you're able to come up with some ideas about the importance of self-esteem. As a social psychologist, we might flip that why question to think, what purpose does self-esteem serve? If it is important, as most people agree that it is, if it is universal, as most people agree that it is in some respect, although there are cultural differences in how we derive self-esteem. In individualistic or Western cultures, we derive it through our personal successes. In Eastern cultures, self-esteem also appears to be important, but it's derived differently. It's more about how you fit in relation to your group and how successful your group is. But you still derive esteem from that. But what purpose does that esteem serve? Now, there are two really primary theories in social psychology about the functions, the purpose of self-esteem. And these aren't the only theories, but these two are really important and really influential. So I'm going to focus on them. One is known as social inclusion theory, and I happen to buy into this one pretty strongly because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's accurate, and it also kind of fits with my evolutionary view of how I tend to view human behavior. So social inclusion theory is pretty basic. The argument is simply that self-esteem is an indicator of social acceptance, that the function of self-esteem is to let us know how we're doing in relation to our social connections. Now, this is often measured with an individual difference measure called need to belong. So need to belong is a scale, I think 12 items on the scale, and they ask you a number of questions. And what they're really gauging is where you fall again on this continuum of this trait. Now, because this is a continuum, it's not that some people need to belong and some don't. It's that we all vary somewhere on this quality of need to belong. But regardless of where we fall, we all have a need to form and maintain at least a minimum amount of important social relations. For one person, it might just be having a close partner or spouse. For another person, it might be having children and being involved with their immediate family. For others, you might need to feel like you're a part of a big community. You need to feel like you have lots and lots of friends, right? So we can vary, but we all have some need for social connection. So according to these researchers, self-esteem acts as a meter, right, or what they call a sociometer. So it's essentially a gas gauge that when our self-esteem is low, it's telling us, hey, your social relationships need a bump, right? You need to get out there and hang out with your friends or make some friends. And we probably all felt this a little bit in the early days of quarantine, right? That when we were taken away from our friends and our family, our self-esteem might have plummeted as an indicator that our social relationships were lacking. They were suffering. Now, another way that this research is often backed up is on research on ostracism. So ostracism or social exclusion is tested very easily, honestly, in the lab. So there's a task that is known as cyberball. And cyberball is really, really, really simple, deceptively simple. Basically, you set somebody at a computer, you tell them that they're going to interact with two other people on computers, and they have a tiny little avatar, just a little cartoon character, them, and there's a little cartoon character representing someone else, and one representing a third person. And the way it's set up is usually you only see your hand as your cartoon character, and you see these other two cartoon characters. And the task is called cyberball. So you start off with a ball in your hand, and you can choose whether to throw it to the person on the right or throw it to the person on the left. So you hit the right key, throws it to them, they throw it back to you, hit the left key, throw it to them, they throw it back to you. And do that back and forth for a couple of iterations. And then suddenly you throw the ball to someone else, they throw it back to the other person, who throws it back to them, back to them, back to them, and they ignore you. Now it seems silly, right? So two people you don't know, in fact, they're just computer simulations, they're not even real people. So ignoring you shouldn't matter, but it does. In fact, it takes about 15 seconds before someone's self-esteem just plummets in response to this task. And the argument from these researchers is that social exclusion, it serves an evolutionary purpose, right? Like you exclude people when they're no longer a part of your group, and that could be a death sentence for them. It's so important for us to have social relations to survive that the worst thing that could happen to you would be banished from your group, and that's carried over with us. The easiest way to upset somebody is not to call them a name or anything like that. It's just to ignore them. Just pretend they don't exist. Think about times that your loved ones may have ignored you. It makes you feel terrible. And this is common across basically all people, right? That we need to belong to others, and our self-esteem is very dependent on it. Okay, so that's one primary argument, right? That's one primary theory. Oh, I'm sorry, I almost skipped ahead too fast. Think about all of this in relation to our modern environment where we rely on social media a lot, right? Social media likes are a false indicator of social acceptance. And I bet there's really easy ways to test or manipulate or even just test correlations between the amount of likes and someone's self-esteem in the moment, right? So if you post something and nobody's liking it, you're suddenly going to feel down on yourself. And it's because it's become a proxy for your social acceptance. Okay, the other major theory of self-esteem function is known as terror management theory. We spent a decent amount of time talking about this in class. I'm not going to spend as much time going over it here, but I will provide the basics of terror management theory. So the argument from terror management theory is that the one thing that makes us uniquely human, that really makes humans unique among the animal kingdom, is our neocortex, is our advanced cognitive abilities that come with the cerebral cortex that, as far as we know, no other animals quite share. It's the reason we have language, not just speaking, but written language as well. The reason we can learn to read written language and we can share in that capacity. The reason we can coordinate so well together is because we can imagine alternate scenarios. We can imagine how people will respond. We can imagine things that might go wrong, and that allows us to advance, so to speak. Now, these researchers argue that, all those things are well and good, but there's one other thing that comes along with our advanced knowledge, and it is the knowledge that we will die. All of us, every single one of us, we're going to die. And as far as we know, even though animals have a fight or flight mechanism when they face immediate threat, as far as we know, no other animals can literally sit and contemplate their own death. And it messes us up. It creates existential anxiety, a kind of a fear of the unknown and what happens and where will I go. So according to terror management theory, the function of self-esteem is really to buffer us, to save us from that existential anxiety that's caused by the knowledge that we're going to die. Now, these researchers argue that many of the things that we consider uniquely human, culture, language, religion, art, that all of these serve a terror management function, that they all help us to prevent us from just the paralyzing dread of our inevitable death. And there are a number of ways that we can engage in these kinds of things to help us reduce this existential terror. One is to believe in something meaningful, to believe in something bigger and grander than we are, and importantly, to believe that we are contributing to something bigger than ourselves. It gives us a standard for value, and we derive self-esteem by participating in these things that are bigger than ourselves, by participating in our religions, by participating in art, by doing things that we think might leave some lasting legacy that might outlive us, right? So if I can gain symbolic immortality through my actions, then my real mortality isn't quite as scary. So we can reduce existential terror by seeing ourselves as a valued member, a valuable member in our world, by doing something, again, that is bigger than we are as individuals. Now, how you might ask, how the heck can you test that, right? Like, that's crazy. How can you test it? And you can actually test it pretty easily. There are two questions. I don't advise you to spend too much time thinking about them. If you want to run your own experiment later, you can actually write your answers to these questions. But basically, you give people just pen and paper and these open prompts and ask them to take the time to really seriously consider and answer these questions. The questions are to please briefly describe the emotions that the thought of your own death arouses in you. And then two, jot down as specifically as you can what will happen to you as you physically die. Pretty basic, right? What you find is after people respond to these prompts, it takes about 5 minutes for it to set in, right? So it has to transition from being outright and in the moment to kind of resonating in your brain a little bit And about 5 minutes after these prompts, you see huge effects on people's psychology. So for instance, I once made the mistake of opening class by having students answer these questions before I launched into this lecture. And about 5 minutes into my lecture, a student kind of ran out of the room crying. Because once it sinks in, it kind of messes with you. This is called a mortality salience prompt, right? So again, salience means like present. And what this does is it makes people cognitively aware of their death. Okay, so what are the consequences of this manipulation? Well, for one, people tend to cling to their worldviews more after this manipulation, and they tend to derogate those that threaten it. So derogate's another research terminology. It just means that they put them down. They are more prejudiced toward them. They view them more negatively. So suddenly people's religions matter more to them. Their nationalities, like nationalism, increases in response to existential threat. A perfect example, and actually the researchers wrote a book on this, was what happened after 9/11, right? So many of you can't remember that. I can, I'm old enough to remember that. But after the September 11th attacks of 2001, suddenly all Americans were made aware that we're not infallible, right? It was basically a big mortality salience manipulation, and nationalism increased like crazy. And then so did derogation of people who weren't perceived as fitting the American values. So there are two sides to this, that as your personal values increase, often that comes hand in hand with devaluing people who don't share those values. So I actually have some research on terror management theory. It's not about self-esteem, but rather about perceptions of atheists. This was a follow-up to my dissertation. And you can see here the name of the article that I published an article in a news source. It was for believers, fear of atheists is fueled by fear of death. That's not exactly what we found. It's kind of a sensationalist title that the editor chose. But what we found is that negative evaluations or prejudices toward atheists are tied to existential concern. So when we made people concerned by having them write about their own death, right? That's a mortality salience manipulation. When we made mortality salient, people evaluated atheists more negatively. And then in this follow-up study, we had people consider atheism. What is atheism? What does it mean? And we found that it actually increased their unconscious thoughts of death. So it made death awareness, it increased death awareness. And so we argue that part of that is because atheists deny the possibility of an afterlife, right? That we buffer our existential dread by believing that we may live on, our souls may live on after we die, and atheists just kind of spit on that idea. And so among our participants, atheists included, non-believers included, remember this is unconscious, after considering atheism, we saw an increase in concern for death. I'll link this in case you're interested in reading the summary of our research. One sec. Okay, so returning to self-esteem, we asked, is it important? We can also ask whether it's good, right? So we talked about its functions, but is self-esteem a good thing? And I think most of us would agree that the answer is yes, but, right? Yes, but we don't want it to be too high. So for instance, high self-esteem brings along with it better self-confidence, that's great. But people with high self-esteem are more likely to put down others. Think about what it means. If you have high self-esteem, you're going to be motivated to maintain that high self-esteem. If you have better self-confidence, you're going to be more likely to kind of look down on people who don't accomplish as well as you or don't present themselves as confidently as you. And you're going to be more likely to use self-serving biases to view yourself positively, to be able to maintain and keep elevated. Just did a little dance on accident, that level of self-esteem. Now, there's a common perception that people with low self-esteem are going to be the ones who are more likely to lash out against others. And we don't actually find that in the research. This is kind of counterintuitive, that people with low self-esteem are more focused on self-protecting. than they are on self-enhancing. They're more focused on just keeping that little bit of self-esteem that they do have than they are on kind of making themselves look good among others. So one could argue, and the argument has been made, that we don't really have to worry about people with low self-esteem as much as we do those with high self-esteem. And we really should be concerned about people with unstable self-esteem. So if you have high self-esteem, but it's stable, then you're not afraid of a little threat here and there. You're not afraid of somebody, kind of calling you out. If you have unstable high self-esteem, then any kind of negative feedback can derail you. So you're going to be very protective, and you're going to lash out against others and try to convince everybody that you're the best. Should sound familiar, especially in relation to that video from the beginning of the lecture. So what are the strategies that we use to self-enhance? In other words, what are our biases when it comes to ourselves? One way that we show self-enhancement biases is in explaining the past. So the self-serving bias is our tendency to make internal attributions for desired outcomes, but external attributions for undesired outcomes. So what does that mean, right? Attributions is like, it's a research word. Attributions are the reasonings you give for events. So let's think back to that exam, if you got 85, and you're really happy with that, especially in comparison to other people, you're going to think, man, this is because I'm a hard worker, because I'm smart, because I got it. But if you're one of those poor suckers who got 65, you're not going to say this is because I didn't work hard enough, or this is because I'm not as smart at this topic as I thought I was. What you're going to say is something like, that exam was unfair. That exam was too hard. That professor just doesn't know what they're doing, right? So internal attributions is giving yourself the credit. But when it comes to blame, we like to find other sources, not ourselves. And that's one way of protecting our self-esteem. So why do we do this? Why do we make self-serving attributions? Well, really because we're motivated to for a number of reasons. Of course, to self-enhance, because it makes us feel better when we can take credit for good outcomes and find blame for bad outcomes. It makes us feel better to ourselves. It also can make us look better in front of other people, right? So self-presentational strategies. One way that this happens, and I can't remember if it's on the slide, so forgive me if I cover it in a moment, is what's known as self-handicapping. So self-handicapping is when you preface your performance with some kind of obstruction, right? So if, for instance, you're about to give a big talk, or I'm about to give a big talk, it's something that is part of my job, and I started off by saying, I'm sorry if this doesn't go well. I've been sick. I've been under the weather. What I've just done is set an expectation that if I do really well, I'm going to look even better because I performed well despite these barriers. But if I don't do well, that's outside of my control. And people will say, well, you know what? It's not his fault. He's been sick. So it's a self-presentational strategy to maintain my self-perception and how other people see me. Another reason we may engage in self-serving biases is because sometimes our outcomes are inconsistent with our expectations. We rarely expect to fail, right? Like that just wouldn't be very healthy if we go in all the time thinking like this is going to be terrible. So when we really do work hard or we have high expectations and bad things happen, well, we need to make sense of it. And that's why we start looking for sources of blame for those bad outcomes. And sometimes our outcomes are inconsistent with our self-schemas, right? So your self-schema is your general attitude about yourself, our self-perception. And we don't like it when outcomes don't match. Like, I know I'm smart, why didn't I do well? And so we have to be able to make sense of that. And finally, our outcomes are sometimes inconsistent with our actions. So maybe I really did work very, very hard, and I still didn't do as well as I'd hoped. Well, if I do a self-serving bias, I can say, this isn't because of me, right? I did everything I could. This is because of something else. This is because of the unfair test or because we weren't given clear expectations. And we also have kind of moving mobile bars that we set. So we set different criteria for desired versus undesired conclusions. So my criteria for perceiving myself might be or perceiving myself as smart might be very low, right? Like um, any little thing. Like if I get a quiz answer right, and when I'm watching Jeopardy, I'm like, man, I'm a genius. But it's going to take a lot of information to make me feel unsmart. Like I don't care about all the questions I miss on Jeopardy. It's the ones I get that I know tell me how smart I am, not the ones I miss, because why would I even know those? Who knows those but weirdos? So we set our bar different for our undesired versus our desired conclusions. Okay, so do we all engage in self-serving bias? Well, the answer is well, mostly yes, but some people engage in it more than others. So for instance, people in, here I say Eastern cultures, but really places where they're less individualistic, which tends to be Eastern cultures, but the US is still more individualistic than even other Western cultures. But we can tie the self-serving bias to individualism. The more important individualism is, the more likely people are to engage in self-serving bias so they can see themselves as good, valuable people. We also know that people who are depressed, right? Depression is different from low self-esteem. Depression is chronic low self-esteem with a number of negative outcomes that come with it. But people who do have generally low self-esteem as well, they tend to engage in the self-serving bias in the other way. If you are motivated to perceive yourself as not smart, not capable, you actually will do the self-serving bias in a way that supports that. Like, oh, here's proof that I'm just no good, which is really sad and very defeating to perpetuate cycles of depression. We also know there are pretty standard differences between men and women on the self-serving bias. So women are less likely to show the self-serving bias. And this is largely probably due to gender role expectations of men and women, right? That men are more interested in status. There are usually prioritize status seeking more than women do. Again, usually there are, of course, exceptions always. We're talking about generalities when looking at groups as a whole or an aggregate. But women tend to be less likely to use the self-serving bias than men. Okay, so we're continuing on with our biases and then we'll wrap this up. If you remember way back to the beginning of this lecture, I asked you to compare yourself in intelligence, honesty, and friendliness compared to the average person. I'll be honest, I think I'm more intelligent than the average person. I also think that all of you are more intelligent than the average person. You've proven that by making it this far in college. That takes just being able to problem solve and write, do all these tasks that the average person doesn't want to mess with. But if I asked you, for instance, to rate yourself on intelligence compared to your classmates or to other PLU students, we can't all be above average. So chances are most everybody says that they are above average in intelligence and honesty and maybe friendliness. I feel like I should have changed that to like morality or something. But that's just impossible. The fact is, everybody can't be above average. Only half of us can be. But most of us perceive ourselves as above average. And this is known as the better than average effect. And this happens when we judge our standing relative to others. So we tend to rate ourselves as better than average. And we do this on things that are important to us. We're better than average in our looks. We're better than average in our intelligence. I'm funnier than average, right? Those things we consider good. We consider ourselves better than the average person. So why? We know that it can't be true all the time because that's just there wouldn't be such thing as an average if that were the case. And there are a number of reasons why we do this. So one, we tend to focus on our intentions when we make judgments about ourselves. We don't focus as much on outcomes. So again, when I think about my morality, well, I don't have a lot of money, so I don't donate a lot of money to charities or anything. And I'm also really busy, so I don't spend my time like volunteering or anything, but I really care. And so I know that I'm moral because I care, right? So I can use my intentions to judge my morality. Whereas when it comes to other people, I can only focus on what I can see. Do they spend their time? Do they spend their money? Well, if not, they must not care. They must not be moral. So that's an egocentric effect, that we're subject to knowing our internal thoughts, but we don't have that information available for other people. We also use idiosyncratic trait definitions. So what does this mean? This means that we use things in a way that works for us, right? So maybe, for instance, I didn't go to college, but I'm street smart, right? I know I'm intelligent. Maybe I know how to fix things. Now, those might not be true of me. I did go to college, obviously. But each individual, each person can take the things that relate to them and say, this is what I mean by intelligence. This is how I know. So it changes, right? You change the criteria so that it fits in a way you want to perceive it. So again, I mentioned egocentrism. So this ties into especially the first part of this, that we can't see other people's internal states. So we can use internal states of ourselves when we're making self-judgments that we can't use when we're judging other people. Now, do we show the better than average effect for all traits? The answer is no. We don't show it for things we don't expect ourselves to be good at. So for instance, if we compare easy versus difficult tasks. So if I ask all of you, like, how good are you compared to the average person at computer programming? Everybody's going to be like, no, I'm way worse than average. Instead of just saying, well, I'm probably average, right? Because we probably are average. In fact, if you know how to turn on a computer, if you can type any semblance of a code, well, then you know better than people who've never used a computer, right? And they do exist. So just that fact alone is going to put you more toward the middle. So we actually tend to show a worse than average effect when it comes to things we have little information about or tasks we're not very good at, when we probably are just average in them compared to the population. Okay, so continuing on with other biases of the self, I actually already mentioned this one. So when preparing for performance, we can use self-handicapping. This is proactively reporting or creating performance impediments so that if you do well, you look great. If you don't do well, you have an excuse. So there are two different types of self-handicaps you can do. One is just reported, telling people like, I've been under the weather, or you can actually take behavioral. So for instance, if you didn't study as much as you wanted because you prioritized something else, you had something going on with your family, then if you don't do as well, you can say, well, I just really didn't have the time to study. And that's not just a report, that's behavioral. So you can actually set yourself up that if you overcome and you outperform, you look great. But then if you don't do quite as well, it's okay, because you do have an excuse, you have an alibi. These lead to a question of whether self-handicaps work. Remember, self-handicapping really is about self-presentation. And research suggests that they do tend to work. Your audiences excuse your performance when you have a reported handicap. So if they know you've been sick, if they know you've been busy, if they know that life has just been insane, they actually tend to give you a little bit of leeway. But it doesn't benefit the way you're seen personally. Your performance is seen as better, but you are perceived worse. You're perceived as making excuses or having other potential problems. So what's interesting is the performance gets a boost, the individual maybe doesn't. There are different conditions that may lead someone to be more likely to use self-handicapping than not. One, surprisingly enough, or I guess ironically, is when the outcome is important. The more important it is, the more important it is to kind of have an excuse in case things go wrong, right? So you need to have some handicaps you can fall back on if the potential for failure can have negative impacts. It's also more likely to self-handicap if the outcome is uncertain. It's not really necessary if you know that you're going to do well as long as you study or anything like that. So the more uncertainty there is, the more likely you're going to create some handicaps. And then finally, if the handicap and the performance are public, right, which adds the social pressure to performance, then you're going to be more likely to self-handicap. Okay. I thought I was going to cut this. I'm just going to skip it. Durability bias, I'll give it a quick definition. is our tendency to overestimate duration of emotions. And imagine, for instance, so if you're Seahawks fans, right, or if you're another fan of something else, then imagine that. I'm not a Seahawks fan. But if I say, imagine how happy you'll be if the Seahawks win the Super Bowl, and you imagine your happiness, and you even feel happy thinking about it, you're like, yes. And I ask, how happy, how long will you stay happy? You're like, man, I'm gonna stay happy for months. And what happens is you're elated for a moment, and then you go to bed, and the next day you're like, ah, man, that was cool, but I have to go back to work. And then suddenly you're like right back down to baseline. And it's the same for negative things. So if I say, how devastated will you be if the Seahawks lose another Super Bowl? You think about it and you're like, that will really suck. I'll feel terrible. And I'll ask, how long will you be sad? And you say, I'll be sad for weeks. And again, what happens is you're really sad for a minute, you're a little bit sad the next day, and then life goes on and you get right back to baseline. That's the durability bias. Okay, so examples include sporting events, elections, breakups, makeups, etc. So here's some research that it was clever looking at these affective forecasts, and that's okay. We're just going to skip that. If you want to ask me questions about it later, you went through the slides, it's fine. Come on. Okay. Comparative optimism is just simply that we expect good things to happen to us, more likely to happen to us than other people, and we expect bad things to be less likely to happen to us than other people. So for instance, if I ask, how many of you think you're going to get divorced? Nobody thinks they're going to get divorced, unless you're like going through a divorce right now. But the fact is, most people will. I think it's over 60% of marriages end in divorce. So if you're going to get married, well, it's a coin's toss. You might get divorced. How many of you are going to get cancer? Right? We just, no, that's not going to happen. So we show comparative optimism. If I asked, how much do you think, how likely is this person to get cancer? Then you're going to say, well, cancer rates are 60%, so they have a 60% chance. Me? No, not going to happen. So we show this for different reasons. We show this comparative optimism for self-enhancement purposes. And again, using different information when we make our own judgment versus other judgments, and the representativeness heuristic. And also, I think it's just functional, right? How awful would it be if every day you honestly assessed your chances of terrible things happening? Like, you wouldn't be able to leave your room. It would just be devastating. So sometimes biases make it easier to function. Okay, so is optimism bad? No, there are actually real benefits, real health benefits of optimism. Optimistic people generally carry less stress, and stress is a killer. All right, so I'm going to leave it at that. I covered the important information. There's, of course, more information on Sakai in the weekly content. I hope you read the text, do your inquisitive, take a look through my lecture I created online just for more information about the self. If you find these concepts interesting, I love to end lectures with recommendations for further reading. If you're interested in terror management theory, I highly recommend the book, The Worm at the Core, by Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Brzezinski. In fact, I got right here my copy, and it is signed by Sheldon Solomon, which is kind of silly because like I could just text him because he was my colleague, but I had him sign my copy, so I'm pretty proud of that. And one thing I didn't talk about, because it'll come up later, is cognitive dissonance, right? So part of the reasons that we don't like when our outcomes don't fit our self-perception is because it creates cognitive dissonance. And so this book, Mistakes Were Made But Not by Me, by Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson, is all about cognitive dissonance. It's all about how we deal with when our outcomes in our real world don't fit our expectations of ourselves and the way we want to see the world, right? Our cognitive biases. And they make a really compelling argument that much of our decisions are fueled by cognitive dissonance. Okay, so that's it. If you have any questions about this, of course, you can ask me in class. You can post into the discussion forum. I'm really happy when students post in there and talk to one another. But just because we're done with this chapter doesn't mean you can move on, right? Like, please keep bringing up these things you find interesting. They make for good conversation. And I'll see everybody in class.